When you start, I mean, if you are presenting on the site, you are presenting the presenter. Okay. When you're supposed to have copy. I don't know what. No one is online. Yes. I think one of the panelists is online. And these are years. These are years. How are you, Lanisa? Can you hear us? Hello, Anita, can you hear us? Hello?
Yes, I can hear you. Good evening. Hello, I can hear you. Good evening.
All right, thanks. I think we should have everybody on the panel ready to go. My name is Ibrahim Babatunde Anoba, a third-year PhD student of African history at the University of California, Davis. It's such a pleasure to be here at LSA and also with fascinating scholars to discuss our respective works. I think I'll have some of my colleagues go first, then I'll go last. So this will be the presentation on wives as human, right? Yes. Wives as human sex. It's interrogated sexuality in the matrimonial system in historical perspective by Churchill Peter Menga from the University of Nigeria. And I believe everybody should have about 12 minutes for their initial presentation. So we take turns, and after that, we have general Q&A. So,
Okay. Good evening, everyone. As the chair of the session we're trying to brief up of our panel. I am Mr. Menga Page, University of Nigeria, Nsukka, and I'm presenting on whites as human beings, interrogating sexuality in two matrimonial system in people. If you are familiar with the history of Nigeria, there is this, should I say, consensus among people that the thief of central Nigeria, that each time you visit them, they have a way of presenting their wives to you as a package. And then the essence they argue is for sex pleasure. And then such white claims have been gained currency even in literature, and then even celebrities like the Big Brother, Big Brother Nigeria that just really controversies were even said that people can't even pay, and then was very, very assertive that by the time you visit a man, that he gives you his wife. He gives his wife. And then even in literature, such accounts are even documented. Of course, we know that stereotypes and misconceptions are normal, so to speak, are normal things we even see. Even in Africa, for instance, when as a student, a 100-level student, we're even told how Africa, for instance, was presented by Eurocentric scholars as even a dark continent. And then even in Nigeria here, there are lots of misconceptions as regards individuals, as regards people, and then all of such. So this paper basically look at the place of wives, in the matrimonial system. And as we are looking at the place of wives, we are now trying to look at sexuality in the matrimonial system. And then geographical sketch, if you are talking about the thief, basically you find the thief around what is today called central Nigeria. Dominantly they are in Benue State, and of course you can still find pockets of thief in Nasarawa, in Taraba, and then in Plateau State. You don't have a rich culture. Even the popular dance, the funny dance that you see, that's one dance that each time you see, you know that at least you are going to see the thief culture. And then of course, let's go straight to the gist. Looking at sexuality in the matrimonial system. I've tried to look at literature, scholars, literature by even the colonialists that even came, the likes of Bohana, the likes of Abraham, that reconstructed the history or the marriage of the history of sea people. They never gave that account of sea persons or sea men presenting their wives as sex packages to visitors. However, such accounts, as I've earlier said, everywhere you go, even on social media, see people and then presenting such wide accounts about the thief people. And then if you look at the pre-colonial history of the thief people, for instance, sex was to be enjoyed, or sex was to be conducted only within the confines of marriage. And then even before the colonialists even came, the marriage system in thief among the thief people was called the Yanshe, which people would not exchange marriage. And by Yanshe, it was as though it was straight by barter. I can just take my sister, give it to you, and then you don't even give me your sister. And it was believed that sex should be conducted within that arrangement. And then when by 1927 that the British abolished the Yamche, the exchange, the marriage exchange system among the two people, and then introduced the bride price, which in Tea it was called Kemkwasi. It was believed that for you to even have sex, you have to Kemkwasi, you have to marry. And then by the time you even marry, then legally, you are not even permitted to even have sex. And then to see how premium was even placed on virginity. When the British time even came, ladies that they discovered that they were even virgin, their bride price was even higher among the thieves than ladies that were not even virgin. For instance, if you are not a virgin, you pay £3 to marry. But if you were a virgin, it was £30 that you now pay. And then, apart from that, even some persons that were not even able to marry, so that they would engage in sex, there was what was called consensual kidnapping. In thief, they call that to elope, you elope someone, you elope a lady, if you don't even have money to go and then marry and then bring a wife to the house, that then you don't even have sex. And then that it was so common among young persons that had never had money, and then it was so common, that practice was common among young men that we are not even working for the colonialists, because when the monetization of Nigerian economy, when the colonialists came, for you to earn money, is either to work on railways, and then most of the British establishments within the Benue Valley or within Tivland. And then most young persons that do not have money, they engage in developing, you develop someone, and then by the time you bring it to your house as your wife, then you are not even permitted to have sex. And then within all of this, thief men were jealous people. Of course, Abraham, for instance, writing in 1933, talk about how the thieves consider their wives as their own property. And then in thief, you can say, take care. And then by the time you are saying, take care, you are not saying, a woman is my property. And then if you are not saying a woman is your property, the question is, why then will you offer a property that you have placed high premium to somebody that has just visited you for midnight pleasure? And then even sex itself, it was something that was conducted with serious privacy. And for Bobana would even argue that even, and then of course the purposeful discussion that I even did, that even within the monetary society, sex was usually at night. And before any activity of such will even occur, that the lantern, for instance, was even lower to the mere direct minimum to show how to show how the value sex and then how it was so conducted in even private. And then of course, in doing in carrying out oral interviews and then focus group discussions, I was able to discover that in pre-colonial civil societies, of course, men that had one or two wives, by the time a visitor would come, it was expected that the younger wife would present water, would possibly present wrapper to that visitor. It was even the man, the Oya, that would even authorize that you make sure you present food, make sure you present drinking water, and make sure you give this visitor water, wrapper. And then as I discovered, it was this kind of thinking, from all that I've gathered, it was this kind of thinking that taught misconception about the two people emerged. And then such stories, such white stories, gain the frequency even in literature. Right? Just, I even forgot that I even gave it. Yes. Yes, I have. Just be going. And yes, just leave her hand. No, take it back. Okay, wives as sex packages. And already I've told us how early research into studies like Abraham, for Gohana, the focus group discussion that I did, how even in their works, there are accounts that has not been documented nowhere, even by the British, even when they even came, writing about the history of the sea people. That the fact that a woman was authorized in the first band to give you water, to give you wrapper. Okay, take it to conclusion instead, 2 minutes. Conclusion towards erasing stereotypes in civil sexual identity. And then I have argued how those stereotypes alone affected interpersonal relationships with people, because I remember vividly I was in Uyo. That was late last year. And then when I introduced myself as a thief person, there's a lady that now just even said, because of tea, I'm not even going to marry you. I don't even want a situation that by the time I even marry you, and then you now have a visitor, you now present me as a state package. And then it gives, automatically I lost my sense of manhood. I was embarrassed. And then I'm advocating that such stereotypes should be erased, not just about the two people, but stereotypes to be erased. Because by the time you continue to give false narratives, false cultural narratives about a particular group of people, in essence, you are now trying to create another identity about them that also that people might even tend to believe. Just like during that conference, all that I said, this young lady was not even convinced, though I'm married. And I said, okay, fine, you can even call my wife, thank God my wife is not even a thief. You cannot even call her if I've ever presented her as a set package.
Well, that is more than fantastic. What a way to open the panel. I'm very sure my colleagues have a lot of questions for you.
Yeah.
Regarding you as a team person and many of the things you talk about. I also have a question for you. Maybe we're going to come back to that later.
Yeah.
So now we go to Damilola Fagite, and our presentation is titled, What About the Mother? Managing Maternal and Infant Well-Being in Colonial Lagos. And she's from the Obafemi Awolowo University in Benin.
All right, thank you so much. Good evening, everyone. And I want to use this medium to thank everyone for being on this panel. All right, so I'll just go straight to the point. And like the chairman said, I'm presenting on what about the mothers managing maternal and infant well-being in colonial Lagos. So motherhood in colonial Lagos was a testament to the intricate history of historical challenges and triumphs faced by women during the pivotal era. So the focus of this paper is actually on an exhaustive exploration of strategies devised to grapple with the pervasive threat of infant and maternal mortality. So in colonial Lagos, the socio-economic terrain was rife with disparities that significantly impacted the lives of mothers. Therefore, the influence of colonial policies on mitigating these challenges offered insight into the contextual nuances that shape the maternal narrative. So cultural influences and traditional beliefs wove an intricate pattern in the fabric of motherhood in colonial Lagos. So this paper seeks to examine the strategies employed by the colonial authorities in particular to grapple with the alarming rates of infant and maternal mortality, especially from the 1920s up to the end of colonial rule in Nigeria, which was, this period was considered in the history of Nigeria, especially when the highest rate of maternal and infant mortality was recorded. So colonial era in Lagos witnessed significant change in various sectors, and of course, the healthcare system was not exempted. So among the critical aspects of colonial health initiatives was the focus on maternal and infant well-being. So before colonial intervention, maternal and infant care was deeply rooted in indigenous knowledge and practices. And by the beginning of the 20th century, a significant number of colonial medical and health professionals had serious concern for the high maternal and infant mortality rates in British colonies. So in Nigeria during this period, high levels of infant and maternal mortality were first identified in the annual medical reports in 1922, when the rate of maternal and infant mortality was at the rate of 290.5 deaths per 1,000 live births. And this was recorded for Lagos alone. So in 1923, the principal medical officer for the country was advised that the colonial government should appoint a committee to investigate the causes of death among babies and mothers. So in response to this, the colonial governor, in the person of Governor Clifford, appointed a commission of inquiry in the same year to look into the matter. So at the end of this, or at the end of their inquiries, they concluded that the heavy loss of infant life was largely due to the faulty conduct of baby deliveries, and then to also treatment of newborn infants, especially by the native midwives and their mothers. So from the committee's recommendation and the various calls for infant and maternal well-being, efforts to provide and, of course, to improve welfare services became part of a broader shift towards public health as a government responsibility towards mothers and children. So indeed, the reduction of maternal and infant mortality became a commonly used indicator for assessing the standard of health in the country. So measures were taken to reduce maternal and infant mortality rates, and this was reflected in how the colonial government conceptualized the problem of maternal and infant mortality by neatly compartmentalizing its solutions into a range of services, including maternal education and maternal services, and as well as medicalization and hospitalization of pregnancy and childbirth, and also, controlled feeding of infants and child rearing practices. So these initiatives in healthcare policy would result in profound changes in women's experiences in childbirth, and also in the role of the state in social welfare. So before the colonial government turned its full attention to medicalizing and hospitalizing pregnancy and childbirth, its focus was first placed on providing maternal and infant welfare services, as well as utilizing them to re-engineer Nigerian motherhood. So as a result, from the beginning of the early 1920s, many maternity and child welfare centers were opened in Nigeria, and of course in Lagos. And these were done either by the government or by the mission churches, and some were opened by voluntary organizations across the country. So in advancing this new ideology of motherhood, the colonial government sought to make women its tool to economic and political preservation. So aside this, colonial health officials also figured that Nigerian mothers with persistent persuasion could be urged to preserve the life of their infants in spite of their sanitary environment and then their maternal ignorance of childcare. So there were arguments here and there that there was a definite relationship between wrongful feeding of infants and then childhood diseases. So the African mothers' practice of carrying their babies on their backs all the time and letting them crawl about in the compound to her, the colonial health officials believed that all of this contributed to poor health in infants, and therefore necessitated the need to reconstruct African motherhood. So while admitting that various factors contributed to high maternal and infant mortality rates in the country, medical officers often blamed native midwives as well for their unskilled interference in deliveries, in baby deliveries of babies, and then which they believe caused mothers to suffer obstructed labor. So repeatedly, the most potent factors given to the high infant and maternal mortality and morbidity were ineffective and faulty mothering skills, poor nutrition, bad housing, and then the bad methods of native midwives. So the latter was, particularly blamed for, I'm talking about the native midwives now. They were particularly blamed for causing umbilical hernia in babies, and this was a frequent occurrence among the newborns during this period. So in many of the reports on maternal and infant welfare, colonial health officials, appeared invaluable for their repeatedly blaming either mothers or native midwives for these recurring problems, and also for low success rate, despite efforts that the colonial authorities were putting in place to reduce maternal and infant mortality. So on rare occasions when mothers and native midwives escaped blame, they put the blame on economy, and then lack of financial resources were also given as the reason for lack of progress in reducing maternal and infant mortality rate. So, and at some point also, they put the blame on ignorance, and that African mothers exposed their infants to diseases as a result of ignorance. Therefore, on this note, the colonial authorities believed that maternal education was the most appropriate tool to rectify the situation. So all mothers could be ignorant, but colonial officials believed that African women, because of the excess time they spent working on the farm and in other domestic duties, were particularly careless, and then they neglected their children. So therefore, they believe that mothers must be educated on their responsibility for maintaining personal hygiene, and then for also controlling hygiene in their domestic space. Okay, so controlling hygiene in their domestic space. Okay, so a lot of measures were put in place. For instance, in 1924, Dr. Cameron Blair, who was the Deputy Director of Sanitary Services in Nigeria, initiated, as part of the Health Week, a baby show, which became very popular with mothers in Lagos and its environs. And this baby show, at some point, they put measures in place whereby babies who were not officially registered at birth will not be allowed to, they were not eligible to participate in the show. And to a very large extent, this increased the number of registered birth registration in colonial Lagos during this time. And it also helped in reducing, to a large extent, to reduce infant mortality rates in colonial Lagos. So with the success of baby shows in Lagos and all of that, colonial health officials, they now moved to intensify the government's motherhood reconstructive programs at their various centers of maternal and infant welfare. Of course, I didn't mention that earlier, that at some point, maternal and infant welfare centers were created in especially urban centers, and Lagos was the main focus. So when Lagos Welfare Center was created, it began operation, and of course, the primary objective was to provide antenatal care to expectant mothers, and then also to offer postnatal care to infants. So all of this helped in, reducing maternal and infant mortality in colonial Lagos. Thank you.
Yes. Thank you so much for a fascinating presentation for real. Because I mean, the idea of baby shows is very interesting. You'll be surprised to hear some of the things that the colonial government did to make people fall in line. But anyway, I'm very sure you'll have questions for her, but we're gonna keep that for later. And we go to Adizat Paudu, and she will be presenting the changing status of women in the socio-economic sector of the Niger-Benue confluence region of Nigeria between 1900 and 2010. And she's from Kwara State University. Adiza, you have 12 minutes. Please go ahead. Your microphone is kind of muted.
We can't hear you.
Are you able to unmute your microphone?
I guess she needs to increase the volume.
No, she's.
Okay, I have unmuted myself.
Yeah, please go ahead.
Can you hear me now?
Loud and clear.
Loud and clear.
Good. Good evening, Mr. Chairman and other panelists. My topic is the changing status of women in the socio-economic sector of the Niger-Benue Conference region, 1900 to 2010. Please, can you see my slide?
Not yet.
Not yet.
Yes.
Oh, I thought I was. I tried sharing my screen just now, and
Do you allow you to share, or do you need access to that?
I saw share and I tried to share.
Yeah, you can just click on the share button and follow that.
Okay. Okay. Are we there?
Almost.
Can you see my slide now?
Almost. Yes, we can see it.
All right.
All right, thank you very much. The topic again is the changing status of women in the socio-economic sector of the Niger-Benue Conference region, 1900 to 2010. So from the title, the work is going to cover the pre-colonial, colonial, and post-colonial period. The socio-economic status of women have changed over time. From the early 1800s, the Niger-Benue Confluence was predominantly traditional, and women were largely believed to bear or carry domestic roles or duties. And this informed the nature of the society, whereby women are limited. They are not expected to be heard in most cases, and even to be seen. And most times they believe women are just to take care of the household, do some farm work, and all that. But over time, this status began to change as women were performing greater roles and were having economic power. Their status also began to change in the region. So I want to quickly look at the geographical background and the women a bit background. The Confluence region is located in the present-day Kogi State, and it is called the Confluence because of the coming together of the River Niger and Benue. So that area where the river meets is called the Niger-Benue Confluence area. But today it is situated in modern Kogi State, and the region it comprises of so many ethnic groups. Uh, some of the groups are Igala, Ibira, Kabanu, Basa, Yoruba, Oworo, Magongo, and other groups. And the women here share similar characteristics, although in terms of physical traits, they may be different. But in terms of the kind of role they play, is completely similar. The methodology adopted in this work is purely qualitative, which comprises the use of primary and secondary data for gathering historical records. Of course, the work cannot do without the use of archival records and also scholarly published works from authors who have written widely on the Niger-Benue Confluence area and on women. Now, in the pre-colonial era, the region itself is structured around agriculture, fishing, trading, water transportation, and indigenous industries such as weaving, bronze casting, pottery, and so many others. Women in this area participate actively in shaping their society in the various economic activities, and they play a very critical role. Although many of them may not participate actively in farming, but they practice what we call local farming. Farms at the back of their house, and some of them produce food crops, spices, and other kind of food that can be consumed. While some women even go as far as producing cash crop alongside with their male counterparts. Aside farming, they were also very active in local trading, and they produced and sold their goods in local markets around the confluence. In the sociocultural sector, the women were primarily custodians of culture, because as it is, it's the role of the women to take care of the home front, to take care of the children, to teach them, to nurture them, the values, the norms, and practices is usually transmitted by women. So those role was played actively by women during the pre-colonial era. And women also serve as mediators, peacemakers. And they try to restore harmony where there's crisis. And these women also serve spiritual roles as priestesses, diviners, and healers. And they also play the roles of midwife and health providers. So all these roles were played, but despite this role, the status of the women were not what it is today. Women were still seen as someone of a lower status, someone who is not equal to a man. So all this role played during the pre-colonial period did not actually make their status higher. They could not stay at par with any man. So now let's look at the 20th century. This period, the status of women began to change gradually because of access to education, health, and greater economic participation. This century also witnessed larger scale of women primarily engaging in trade, crafts, and also in the colonial services. So during this colonial era, the little access to education, girl child education, sorry, and also access to some colonial policies that allow them to gain money, because some of them producing cash crops sold some of this crop and they made money out of it. So this little economic power gain increased the status of the women, for not just someone who sits down and listens, but someone whose voice can be heard. In fact, by 1951, Ibera women stood up and revolted against excessive taxation. And so women also tried to challenge the status quo or wanted a greater participation, although that political participation was not strong until the 21st century. Now, in this century, the status of women undergo substantial changes, reflecting a lot in the global and national trend. Today, the slogan is gender equality and women empowerment. Yes, women during this period were greatly empowered. They now have access to formal education, not just primary, post-primary, and even tertiary education. Many of them play key roles in sectors such as education, healthcare, banking, information, and technology. So, in conclusion, the role of women and the status of women have changed over time. Women has evolved from not just being a mother, a housewife, and a homemaker. So the Niger Benue Confluence region is not an exception. Women in this area had gradually moved through time, through activities, through events. Their status have changed to a woman who not just sit down and wait for the man to do everything, rather a woman who contributes equally to the home front and who still plays that domestic role as a wife, as a mother, and as a homemaker in their various regions and in their home. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Lisa. So we're gonna take my own presentation and take questions. So please still stay around. Well, thank you for taking the time to come listen to us today. My name is Ibrahim Babatunde Anoba, and I am a PhD candidate in African history at the University of California at Davis. My presentation today is on actually one of the methods I am trying to deploy in my dissertation research. So I'm not presenting a paper or a full dissertation, it's just about my neat aspect of my methods. And this method is simply about looking at how supernatural events and actions were rendered as tangible entities that could be placed in courts of law as evidence and as complaints. And my dissertation, I am simply trying to understand how African spiritual practices and spiritual institutions changed in response to the presence of European jurisprudence in Southwest Nigeria from the start of colonial rule until the 1970s. So this kind of gives the context. And as we know, following Britain's annexation of Lagos in the mid-19th century, one of the most critical questions the colonial administration had to answer concerned how to define the place of indigenous African religions in a society that now, starting from 1861, accommodated an unprecedented number of non-African residents, practicing different versions and sub-denominations of the Abrahamic religion. So this is a question other Europeans, more significantly European Christian missionaries, have tried to answer prior to 1861. In other words, the place of African spirituality, African religion, and those institutions in colonial context. In the early years of colonial rule in Southwest Nigeria, which is my primary location of interest, we see that a few colonial legal authorities attended to complaints concerning witchcraft. Among such individuals and groups, and this colonial authorities included the consular courts and the Lagos Supreme Court, and there are quite several others which also had the same function. And at the same time, two parallel indigenous judicial frameworks existed that also attended to witchcraft accusations. So that there were the colonial authorities treating witchcraft, but also there were indigenous Yoruba or Southwestern Nigerian indigenous authorities attending to the same accusations. And the first set of those indigenous authorities comprise the compound courts and the ward courts. And the second set included the likes of the Ogboni and Oshogbo Senates. And as several scholars of law in colonial Southwest Nigeria have argued, the judicial powers of this parallel indigenous legal authorities greatly diminished as the colonial timeline progressed in the 20th century. So by the way, when I'm using the word witchcraft, which is very loaded in this presentation, I'm pretty much using it only for convenience to refer to what scholars in different fields have referred to at different times to include folk healing, African religion rituals, black magic, voodoo, African supernatural powers, and more recently, esoteric science. As we have been made to understand in the historiography of colonial Nigeria and indeed Africa, the obsession to render legible and control the private lives of African colonial subjects largely prompted European administrators to introduce laws and other modern legal instruments into African spaces. The introduction of the first set of witchcraft laws in Nigeria actually started in the first decade of the 20th century. And this owed pretty much to the need to render legible witchcraft attitudes and consequently curtailed those attitudes, which of course was never being successfully contained anyways. However, one other important factor necessitated this set of witchcraft laws to be enacted in colonial Nigeria. And it had to do with the embarrassing outcome of Britain's war on the Aro Confederacy, or what we today refer to as Igboland, between 1901 and 1902. And this set of witchcraft laws was also some of the earliest interventions of their kind anywhere across British colonies in Africa. And an ordinance enacted in 1903 officially set the legal basis or the definition of witchcraft in Nigeria. Also, the British thought it never really defined witchcraft, but the intent was to have that ordinance define what witchcraft is. And this particular witchcraft ordinance and its subsequent amendments became the official guide for indigenous and European judicial officers, as I explained earlier, across colonial Nigeria. So Nigerian judicial officers, especially chiefs under the supervision of European district officers, were largely domiciled with the responsibility of interpreting and applying the 1903 witchcraft ordinance in the native courts. And this is where it gets quite interesting. So you probably assume that asking local Nigerian chiefs in the native courts most of whom had no formal training in English laws, to interpret and apply witchcraft ordinance would be problematic. Well, this was indeed the case, more so throughout the first 3 decades of the 20th century. The ordinance's ambiguity in defining what was witchcraft and what was not witchcraft actually resulted in the conviction of thousands of Nigerians on the back of the ordinance and the subsequent amendments. Reading the transcript of these cases in the native court records, especially those litigated between 1900 and the 1930s, I could not help but assume that the ordinance's implementations engendered several episodes of mass incarceration throughout the space of 40 years in colonial Nigeria. So by 1954, the majority of these convictions would have happened in northern Nigeria. And a few thousands of them actually occurred in southwest Nigeria, or what people sometimes refer to as Yoruba land. Well, the hard pill to swallow in this whole narrative is that local Nigerian chiefs were actually the judges, as we know, and the juries in this native courts, which kind of complicates further what scholars like Professor Moses Ochonu and Professor Richard Roberts have referred to as a kind of soft colonialism. It's kind of complicated here. But nonetheless, my interest in this method is for now relegated to the native courts in southwest Nigeria, even as witchcraft was officially recognized, or categorized as criminal offense under colonial law. Interestingly, witchcraft cases litter not only the criminal case records, but also the civil case records, which shows another layer of ambiguity regarding how witchcraft was legally defined. It also points to the fact that matters like divorce, inheritance, contract disputes, which were categorized as civil cases, also often involved witchcraft accusations. That is, witchcraft was on paper a criminal offense, but in actual practice, it was litigated as both civil and criminal. As several scholars of colonial Nigeria, Africa, have established, tensions about witchcraft and so-called witches, and I'm using these two words with absolute caution, almost always tied to tensions about public health, population control, nationalist agitation, and responses to changing economic realities. This was, of course, as you can expect, the case in colonial southwest Nigeria. For example, the smallpox outbreak in Abeokuta in 1910 resulted in mass convictions of residents of that town who tried to devise indigenous remedies to deal with the pandemic. Along a similar thread, when some Nigerians started to fortify themselves with African amulets and talisman at the moment of their deployment to fight in World War II, many of them eventually were deemed to have run afoul of one of the several witchcraft laws. So the point I'm trying to make here is that native court records in southern Nigeria tell us about how African elites like chiefs, serving as judges and juries in the native courts, responded to seemingly non-legal areas of scholarly interest like public health and the World War II, just the same way as it tells us about the making of colonial jurisprudence and so on. So my work with the native court record is still very much in its infant stage, but I hope to delve into them more fully during the summer. And to reiterate, the native court records for southwest Nigeria that I have very briefly looked at covers roughly between the 1900s through the 1940s. But of course, the record extends beyond this limit. The court records are, as expected, divided into civil courts records and criminal court records. However, as I said earlier, both contain witchcraft cases. Several of these cases were, as I expected also, brought before the court by individuals, families, and groups, but many of the cases, surprisingly, were actually initiated by Nigerian chiefs themselves. So you have the judge initiating cases that he himself will actually eventually litigate. And lastly, witchcraft was loosely defined throughout this period, and the problem of definition itself was in fact the one reason why thousands of Nigerians were convicted of the crime. And the one more thing that I would not have, and I'll keep for maybe future presentation, is how, if you kind of observe, everybody else talk about women, and I'm pretty much talking about witchcraft. So there seems to be something going on where we talk about witchcraft in Nigeria, people by default will think about women. But you'd be surprised, in early colonial Nigeria,
That's right.
in early colonial Nigeria, the witches were not women at all. They were something else. I'm not going to say here, but maybe in the future. But anyway, thank you, and we can take the questions now. So we're going to take all the questions, and when you make your questions, please tell us where you are studying or working at, and then we can direct the questions to people. I think I see Shola Daniels. Please go ahead. Sorry, my mistake. All right, go ahead.
Thank you very much. You said my name, but I'll say it again. My name is Oluwaseun Daniels from the University of California, Davis, and most importantly, I work on sex and shame. Yeah, and my question goes to the first speaker, the first panelist. Yeah, because I was, I was thinking in my brain like, okay, let me just come for this panel, attend one of the presentations and leave, but his presentation has glued me to my seat, and I think I have nowhere else to be than to be here. So my question is about his work, because I have done many years of research on sex and shame, and I think our work or her works intersect in so many ways. How do I mean? I work on what Yoruba call, part of what I work on really, what Yoruba call ale. That is what people generally call concubinage. It's not concubinage. It's not that. It's definitely not that. Some also call it extramarital affair. It's not that. My whole concept, the way I, experience ale in some parts of Yoruba, the way I have seen it in my research is not about concubinage, and it's not extramarital affair, it's intramarital affair. So I research ale as a kind of intramarital affair that is within the family. So what do I mean ale in terms of sex, between a married woman and the men in a husband's family, not just the husband, but the men in the family. So that is where my work intersects with his work, because his work is also talking about sex between married women and, men from outside the family. But mine is about, men within the family. That is why it's intramarital sex. Now, my question is this. I have comments. I'm sorry, I'm not going to bore you, but I just want to express myself, really. So my question is this, that if it is about sex, between the wife and people from outside the family, and we are talking about how the men perceive it, how the men see, the wife as property, what about the perception of the women? How do they see, how do they experience this? What is their own thought about the sex? How do they even experience, that kind of sex? Because in my own research, I've discovered that many of these women, they really enjoy this, right? They enjoy this. You'll be surprised. Many of these women enjoy this, and they use it as a form of sexual mobility. Why? How do I mean? In the kind of linear sexuality that we know, where the wife would only have sex with the husband, that is the one you know, right? That's the one we want to think we know, because sex is conservative. Fine, period. But in this case, women use this to also explore their sexual desires. So we always want to think that married women don't have sexual desires beyond their husbands. But in the real case, not just in the pre-colonial, colonial period up till now, women still have sexual desires beyond their husbands. And they use all this kind of intramarital, this kind of wife as gift to experience it. So how do you describe the experience of women, right, in this kind of sexuality? And this kind of sex, in my own research, I discovered that it also helps solve the problem of impotence, husband's impotence, infertility in the marriage, because if the husband is infertile, they could have sex with a stranger and the child belongs to the husband, because every child from the wife belongs to the husband because of the marriage, because of the bride wealth. And I want to ask again also that, did you also find cases of intra-family, or intramarital sex in this, or is it just a case of the wife as gift to the outsider? What about the case of wife as gift to the insider? I'll stop talking. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Okay. Good evening, everybody. My name is Ola Sunbatuta from Lagos State University, Department of Sociology. So if I can get first speaker, I really love your work. Beautiful, beautiful work. And if I can get him correctly while listening to him, he was demystifying that assertion. He was trying to let us understand that it's a myth. It never happened. That was what he was saying all through his paper. So those questions you asked, I'm not sure you can get answer to it if what he's saying is a myth or from the beginning. So there will be no exchange. In fact, there is no exchange of wife. There is no incentive. There's no gifting in the first place. But I would like to suggest this, that the first speaker, I think that to help us really understand your paper well, you could do a tweak to the topic, helping us understand that you are demystifying what we feel is a fact about the TV people, instead of, interrogating. So you could just say demystifying wives as human gifts among the TV people. So it makes people understand what you are saying. And at the end of the day, you wouldn't get questions like what we are getting right now. Thank you very much.
So let me ask. So I want to add, because he mentioned some traditional names of the practice. Maybe you came late. He mentioned traditional names of the practice before saying some people call it me. So by mentioning traditional names of the practice, it means it was actually practiced. So I heard this correctly. Yes, it was actually practiced. So I heard correctly.
These are two fantastic
yes.
questions.
Yes.
Like you have no close questions to answer. No, not yet. So let's take the question. Making one as
All right, good evening, everyone. My name is Iyanoluwa Akinola from University of Nigeria and Nsukka. Okay, I think my question is actually outside this one. I want to ask, is based on locating witches and witchcrafts and all of that. I want to ask, a woman involving herself in a traditional court, can you also equate that as witchcraft? Because most times I would say that one of my paternal grand aunt, she became a chief, and ever since then, people in my family portrayed her as a witch. So, but coming to study, I found out that it is not. But to now analyze it, I don't know how to do so. So will you say a woman or a man involving himself in a traditional culture, court that has had to do with the culture, the tradition of that community, will you say that that person is a witch, is a wizard, or is a part of the practice of witchcraft? Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Any more questions? Thank you. Okay.
I feel I came late. I came really, but with what? Okay. I said I came late. Reporting myself first. Then what I want to ask is that witchcraft, is it always derogatory? The concept of witchcraft, is it always derogatory?
Taking that, taking that at this point forward. So you take two questions and we start. My name is taking that as a point of reference. You didn't really tell us the parameter with which the colonial Nigerian native court used in determining or fishing out people as witches. And we have classes of witches in the Yoruba context. We have white witches and the one involved in they are both involved in esoteric science or practices. There are white witches and black witches. So there are classes of witches. Yes. How do we determine their engagement as positive or negative? Some witches are good.
Yes. Okay. My name is Ebon, and my doctoral thesis is also related to the native courts, and I'm also looking at the criminal cases on terms of witchcraft, and looking at how witches were actually identified. Most of the records I studied were looking towards juju, the use of juju, which leads to murder and stealings and all those things, which also really led to a lot of people in prison. So basically, it was out of all the records I read, they were really pointing at the witchcraft use of juju, which led to the killing of people, right? So I don't know about the civilian cases. Civilian cases may be totally different on how they identify or define witchcraft, but in the more criminal cases or murder cases I read was the use of things to kill people. That's what they considered as witchcraft. But for you, my question is, what framework are you using to navigate your work on witchcraft in native courts? Yes.
I just want to add something to your point. So for me, I'm coming from the aspect of witchcraft that it is identified during the colonial era that while treating malaria, at first, indigenous Africans were not they are not administering anti-malaria to them, and they were in the hands of their indigenous native doctors, which in some context too, you can see which doctors. And another thing I want to mention is that some malarias are called akoba. Yes, I read it there's a historical book I read. I called akoba, and you have to appeal the gods. There are some consultation that you have to undergo in treating those malarias, and you should put that in context. Like when you're talking about witchcraft and all, I feel like that's what I'm. Thanks to everyone to ask questions. So that will go to the response. And I'm really praising you for a good job. Okay, that was my yeah. So So you take 5 minutes.
Okay, 5 minutes. Okay, yeah. I so much like the dimension you even brought as regards issues of sexuality. If you look at the perception of women. One, women, to a larger extent, young families, they never had a say. I'm telling you the way it was. Because even if your husband was unable to guarantee sexual satisfaction on no account, and then the reason was simple, because within a chief cultural system, it was believed that women were custodians of culture, and then most persons that even engage in issues of witchcraft, it was believed they confide with their wives. Their wives were in the know of all of these practices. And then by the time you allow this woman who now engage in sexual activity with another person, and then even experience orgasm that you have not even been given, the secret of the house is even leaked. So it was a matter that women were watched. And then issue of intra-marriages within Thief society, yes. On another account that you now even said, issue of men being impotent. But whereas in Thief society, it was even older men that would not even go and marry young ladies. And then the whole thing was in such a way that it must be somebody within the family. That the family secret, that even if the woman will be sexually satisfied, the family secret should be leaked within. It was never for strangers. That's why, yes, intramarriage sex along family lines. And then you said, I'm coming. There are two different things here now. Thank God she even used the word intra, within family. Are you following? And then I've even able to explain why it was within. Because of course, like just the other dimension that you said, I was even surprised that even you said even the Yorubas. Like it was even believed the issue of blood. You know, humans can be linked to blood. I would say, I want to. And then it was even believed that one, a woman, you are not even supposed to go and bring another blood from outside. Yes, to thank you, to contaminate the family. And then I will explain why, even if younger women that might even lost the husband, it was even believed that someone in the family should even take them and then ensure that their psychological, sexual, and every needs are even met. It was never for outsiders. And such women were never presented to strangers. I don't know that.
Okay, so I'm sure people want to. What's that? Are they gonna type on? Okay, Matthew, are you there? Yes, please, yes. Sorry, we can't see the Zoom yet, so I apologize for being with you. Are you able to speak now?
No worries. Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Sorry. Thank you so much for your presentation. I appreciate all the presenters. I just have a couple of questions for Ibrahim Anoba on the presentation on witchcraft. Thank you for that. My first question is, I'm curious to know if whether people designated as witchcraft during colonialism are people that transgress constructed boundaries, maybe constructed gender boundaries, or people that actually disrupted social stability or established colonial institutions. I'm just curious, about, who are the people that actually designated as witchcraft. Then that brings me to the second question of, the concept of witchcraft itself, right? How did the colonial government or the colonial administrator define witchcraft? How did the local chiefs and kings define witchcraft? And how did the people, how was witchcraft also defined by the everyday people in southwestern Nigeria? I think, thinking through these three different, conceptual understanding of witchcraft might then enable us, think through some of the questions that some of my other colleagues also raised about, who are these people practicing witchcraft, and what do we even mean by witchcraft? What sort of witchcraft, are people practicing? Do we also regard Yoruba herbalists, Ifa priests, and and what have you as witchcraft as well? So just defining that concept. Then my third question is, thinking about using court records to pause, using court records, and what has court records, revealed to you about question of agency, right? Then my fourth question, which is the last question, is thinking about the political economy of witchcraft, right? So how did the colonial state also use, convicting people through courts? How did they actually use that to maybe to make money or to probably yeah, just is there any sort of financial and financial importance or engagement when it comes to convicting people that are labeled as witchcraft? Do they have to pay any fine, or what penalty or punishment were they actually subjected to? Thank you so much again. I look forward to your responses. Thank you.
Thank you, Matthew. Well, the funny thing is that Matthew also works in witchcraft, so he's as equally capable to respond to all these questions he's asking himself. Yeah. But he decides to ask those questions anyways. But anyway, thank you for the question. But before I respond to my own questions, I have a question for my colleague, Daviola. But to you as well, I wish I was still here. The back and forth you guys were having about this never happened, this happened. It reminds me of what my advisor often say. You guys are talking about this thing as though it never changed over time, as though it was always static and it never changed. So I was hoping you guys could have talked about what changed and when. How does this intra and extra affairs among the people changed? Was it always static, which I don't think it will ever have been static? So maybe you want to respond to that if you have time. But to Damilola, your work about bats population bad side population control in Lagos. It reminds me, as most everybody know here, about the work of Nancy Rose Hunt, Colonial Lexicon, about German or Belgian Congo, and how that was almost always about population control, the intention that the population do not like window, and the colonial governments needed, in that case, they needed the money, they needed the people to work on the farm because of the changing nature of ownership and slavery and whatnot. So I wonder if ownership and slavery had a role to play in that obsession by the colonial government in Lagos on fixation on birth changes, and how the local or indigenous birth rituals responded to the introduction of the so-called modern alternatives. So to respond to the questions, I've been pushing like 9 or 10.
No, they're not, sir.
Okay, so and I have 5 minutes. So the first question I think is about women joining traditional healing or so-called cults, and how they became regarded as witches. Well, I mean, I don't know a definitive response to that, but what I can say is, in many of the cases I saw, people patronizing indigenous healers, at least in the first 2-3 decades of the 20th century. I mean, 1910, 1920s, 1930s. Many of the people actually patronized local healers, smallpox healers, or Osonyi, or what you can call Eleyomo today. There were instances where these people were arrested, right? And primarily because of, claims about public health. They caused problems in terms of public health. And also in the 1910s, that particular case in Abeokuta, it was so big, so much that if you go patronize a native, so-called a native doctor for treatment of your smallpox, both you and the native doctor will be arrested. So, and I also have a problem with the word cults, women joining cults, because I think it was Tabitha Wills, one of the panelists yesterday on a different panel, one of them spoke about masquerade in Yoruba and Benin. It can't call our attention to how we use the word cult or cults in addressing colonial context. But I hope that answers your question. I don't think I have a definitive response to that. The second question about why is the word witchcraft derogatory? First of all, I caution that I'm using the word witchcraft, knowing very well that I almost spent 2 weeks in my prospectus defining witchcraft to my advisor, because she can't be here and I'll be using the word witchcraft. But I have to use the word witchcraft because that's what many people will understand. I would have preferred alternative like esoteric science, like Eric Betrick will encourage us to do. But I'm using that word witchcraft because it was actually one of the 3 words, witchcraft, ordeal, and juju. Those 3 words were actually the words used to introduce the first ordinance that's pretty much guided what we know as witchcraft in Nigeria today in 1903. So I'm only using that word for convenience. And of course, people like Mohammed Mamdani have told us so much about how colonial officers needed to define and categorize African attitudes for legibility purposes. So maybe you can refer to that later. Then parameters for determining which is a native courts. Parameters, well, it's also moody. So as I said, my research is pretty much in the front stage. And what I've observed so far is that the actual cause of many of the thousands of convictions was the problem of defining who was a witch. It was never clearly defined. Pretty much the chiefs, the kings, some of our kings, I'm talking about people from Ibadan. There are kings and chiefs and ballet, and which is Ibadan today. They had problems defining who a witch was. And in many cases, some of the people who eventually convicted on a witchcraft basis were people that the kings or chiefs had very with themselves. So it's always moving. It was never started. It was never clearly defined. And that was the basis of all the whole witchcraft problem anyways. The question about juju has always framework for navigating witchcraft cases. I still am thinking about how to do that because it's so challenging to render legible the supernatural because the colonial administrators try to do that to a negative end. But our people, the colonial chiefs or the Yoruba chiefs, try to do the same by bringing people accused of witchcraft or people that actually making the accusation into court and having them make testimonies. There were also very intricate instances of some what you might consider ritual processes ongoing in the native courts delegations. So the whole process of navigating witchcraft cases, I'm still not figuring that out yet, but which is the reason why I'm hoping to get some advice in gatherings like this. And witchcraft doctor versus native doctor, conk malaria or that's actually a very brilliant question because at some point, I think Matthew made a presentation last week at the conference we organized online at the Youth Students of California system. You know, making brilliant case about how this criminalization of indigenous medicine actually came back. And a lot of people have actually written about that. But it so much tells us about how that process of, first of all, being considered a witch to now be considered a witch doctor, like a fixing doctor with witch, which it was a word that people were jailed for decades. So why all of a sudden you are fixing doctor to witches? So it's a very big question to respond to, and I'll just say I'll refer you to the secondary sources. Then witchcraft designation, who was witch and who was not witch. Yeah, that's what I'm trying to figure out. No, but I mean, I think if we say witch today, people think about women, or wizard, and it refers to men. But that categorization was extremely convoluted in terms of gender before the 1940s. And the question about court record agency. Now, as you guys probably know, with court cases, many of these things were written in the colonial language, more so the court record. I mean, we have Yoruba chiefs, the Alake and his council, making a decision about the witchcraft case that is being written down in English. So there's a problem of translation in the first place, and many of the testimonies are not written verbatim. So it's actually kind of difficult to ascertain how much agency the litigants or the accused had. And lastly, the political economy, of course, a lot of money was made for the colonial administration with all the fines. In fact, majority of the convictions led to fines. And we can talk about that one later. But I want to segue to my colleagues here to answer their own questions.
Okay.
So Dr.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you very much. So I'll just quickly go to your questions, and then of course I also have some questions, but I don't know if when I'm done with my questions. Okay, all right, beautiful. So all right, yeah, I read Nancy's work, Colonial Lexicon, and of course I agree with you with the fact that it was centered around population control, birth control, leading towards population control, and then for the purpose of ownership and slavery and all of that. All right, but in this case, actually, the attention given to maternal and infant well-being, by introducing maternal and infant welfare services in Nigeria was actually a part of a larger imperial public health policies, public health initiative as put in place by the colonial government. Okay, so it's still an ongoing research anyway, and of course, it is part of what I've presented today. Is part of the broad idea of what I have for my doctoral thesis, which I am working on. So, of course, I will soak this in and then also try to figure out if the whole idea was actually as a means of controlling the population in colonial Nigeria. All right, then to your second question about local indigenous midwives, how they responded to the colonial health initiative, if I'm correct, right? So, of course, at some point, there was a Midwifery Act, which was put in place which was introduced by the colonial government. And the whole idea of this Midwifery Act was to incorporate this indigenous midwives into the broader healthcare system by training them, organizing training by the European health officials in the colonial period. And also, the whole idea was actually to formalize midwifery education. So there was midwifery education, and then by this time, all these indigenous midwives, especially from the faith homes, the Aladara churches, which is actually like the core of my work, of the core of what I'm doing, established, we're licensed to establish midwifery school, whereby all these indigenous midwives were enrolled and were trained and they were licensed to practice. So it was a form of incorporating them into the broader healthcare system, where trainings were given to them from time to time by, most importantly, the European health officials. So I think I've answered your question.
Yes.
So can I ask my question?
Yes, you ask your question. Then the lady asked her questions.
Okay.
So, hold on, let her ask.
Okay, so while Memka,
Yes.
let me just go by that, was when it was presenting, some of the questions that popped in my head was that, okay, was there any point whereby the women, resisted this tradition in that sense? And of course, were there efforts to challenge or probably to change these practices? So that is for you. Then for Ibrahim, for my master's thesis, I worked on smallpox outbreak. Yeah. I worked on smallpox outbreak, and I think I've published 2 papers on smallpox. The 3rd one is on the way on smallpox outbreak in southwestern Nigeria generally. And of course, I cannot but agree with you that during the outbreak of smallpox in southwestern Nigeria, the colonial government at some point claimed that the so-called witch doctors alleged that they were sabotaging the effort of the colonial authorities, the colonial health officials, in eradicating smallpox and the management of smallpox outbreak in southwestern Nigeria. And they alleged that they were encouraging the people to, to refuse vaccination and then coming to them directly. So at some point, there were rules put in place, policies put in place to ensure that any form of outbreak is being reported. And a situation whereby it is not reported, they were being sanctioned. Both the witch doctors, the so-called witch doctors, and then the traditional rulers. So you may want to, look into that and then see how well you can make do with that. Then, of course, at some point they also alleged that they were actually the causes of they were causing outbreak and the spread of smallpox in southwestern Nigeria. So then I also want to ask that, were there any legal, as you were also presenting, some questions also popped in my head that, were there any legal procedures followed in native courts for witchcraft cases? That is number one. Then number 2 was that did colonial authorities at any point reconcile their own legal standards with indigenous beliefs in witchcraft? So those are my questions. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. And we'll take the lady.
Okay. So I want to ask about, you mentioned that in trying to control probably the national mortality crisis, including Lagos, then probably the colonial authorities kind of instituted or worked on creating institutions like the religious midwifery institutions, to reach out. They may be probably what you said. But I just want to ask, were there also religious factors or probably cultural factors that created a bridge in trying to reach these women, the mothers, the pregnant women? Were there also factors like that? And if there were, how was it? I'm going back to colonial Lagos now, or probably let's say colonial Nigeria. So were the colonial authorities able to solve that problem? Were they able to solve that issue? Like, I mean, the issue of having religious factors, traditional factors, not these beliefs, trying to create a bridge in reaching these women. How were they able to solve these issues?
Okay.
Sorry, because you mentioned about the religious midwifery institutions.
Okay.
So I want to just understand.
Thank you. So, because we're almost running out of time, I'm going to take 1 minute, 30 seconds each to respond to the questions. Yes, so 1 minute 30
Okay.
seconds.
All right, thank you. Okay, so what I was saying about religious midwives and all of that was that at some point, of course, when we talk about midwifery and all of that, it is there's a cultural context to it, and then social context and all of that. But what I was saying in the context of religious midwifery in that sense was that, okay, in colonial Nigeria, colonial southwestern Nigeria, colonial Lagos, of course, there were indigenous midwives. Of course, they were known as, in Yoruba context, from the faith homes, Yagbebi, and all of that. And what I was trying to say was that, okay, by the time, going by his question that, okay, the local indigenous midwives, how were they able to respond to colonial health initiatives and all of that? Okay, so what the colonial government did was that they gave the license to the church in that sense, and specifically the Aladura churches, and even more specific, the Christ Apostolic Church. And that is why you have the midwifery school of the Christ Apostolic Church currently in Ede, where in Ede, in Osun State, where midwives, the so-called indigenous midwives, were trained initially by the Europeans, and then also, and currently it is still on, even as we speak. Okay, so that is what I was saying about that. And of course, when you talk about cultural bridge, of course there was cultural bridge. And the cultural bridge, in my explanation, in my presentation the other time, I was talking about the colonial authorities, how they perceived motherhood, mothercraft, and some of the allegations they made towards mothers, and as to what was causing maternal and infant mortality in southwestern in Lagos during the colonial period. And some of the allegations were that they were not, they were ignorant, they did not have knowledge of how to take care of babies, patronizing indigenous midwives who were considered not knowledgeable in this midwifery act. Okay, and all of this, if you look at it, they tended towards cultural dimension to this whole thing. And in bridging this gap and to reconcile the conflict was the introduction of the Midwifery Act by the colonial authorities. And just like I've explained what the Midwifery Act was all about here.
Well, thank you. I'm going to take maybe 1 minute and you asked a question about reconciliation of local witchcraft knowledge with school. I mean, as we know, eventually it's the narrative in colonial Africa. It's always about the colonial officers had an obsession with an African attitude, in this case, witchcraft. They could not understand it. They introduced new laws to understand it. And eventually, their own understanding of witchcraft eventually became influenced by local understanding of witchcraft. I mean, the mere idea of appointing witch doctor or native doctor in itself. I mean, people are giving official certificates as native doctors. It means you're reconciling what you were opposed to before with what you think is actually standard. So I hope that sheds some light, but we actually out of time. And I want to thank everybody for joining the session. Thank you so much. Let's enjoy our dinner.
Thank you.
Thank you.